Lily had always loved nature. As a child, she spent hours in her grandmother's garden, enchanted by the fluttering butterflies and buzzing bees. Now, as an adult, she wanted to create that same magic in her own home, a place where nature could thrive amidst the cookie-cutter conformity of her suburban neighborhood. For years, Lily nurtured a small flower patch in her backyard, but it wasn't enough. Her front lawn, with its endless expanse of dull grass, felt like a wasted opportunity. Lily wanted something more, a vibrant, living garden that would attract birds, bees, and butterflies, while also being environmentally sustainable. One bright spring morning, armed with gardening gloves and a determination to bring her vision to life, Lily began her project. She tore up the turf, replacing it with rich, dark soil. She planted clusters of native wildflowers like black-eyed Susans, milkweed, and coneflowers, their colors bursting like fireworks against the greenery. Along the edges, she added ornamental grasses and a few shrubs to give the garden a sense of structure. In the center, Lily installed a simple bird bath, and next to it, a charming wooden butterfly house that her teenage daughter, Mia, painted bright yellow with tiny floral designs. She even created a small patch of clover to replace some of the grass, knowing it would provide food for pollinators while staying low maintenance. Every day, Lily poured her heart into her garden. She'd wake up early to water the plants, adjust the mulch, and marvel at the life it was attracting. The garden buzzed with activity, sparrows splashing in the bird bath, bees moving purposefully between flowers, and butterflies dancing in the sun. At first, her neighbors seemed intrigued. Mr. Jenkins, her elderly neighbor across the street, gave her a thumbs up as he shuffled out to get his newspaper one. "Looks beautiful, Lily," he called. A woman walking her dog stopped to admire the butterfly house, and even asked where Lily had been. Kids from the neighborhood paused to watch the sparrows as they flitted between the bird bath and the shrubs. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. One afternoon, as Lily was pruning her flowers, she spotted Deborah, the president of the HOA, walking slowly down the side. Deborah was a tall, sharp-featured woman, with a clipboard perpetually clutched in her hand. Her gaze swept over Lily's garden, and her expression tightened as she took in the wildflowers and the pile of mulch Lily had yet to spread. Lily offered a polite wave, but Deborah didn't respond. She stood there for a moment longer, her lips pursed, before turning on her heel and walking away without a word. Lily's stomach tightened. Deborah had a reputation for enforcing the HOA's rules with an iron fist, and Lily had seen firsthand how her neighbors had been fined for minor infractions like mismatched flower pots or holiday decorations left up a day too late. The next morning, Lily found a letter in her mailbox, the HOA logo stamped prominently at the top. Her heart sank as she opened. "Dear Miss Carter," it read, "your front yard garden has been found in violation of HOA landscaping guide. The unkempt appearance of the yard and the presence of non-compliant plants detract from the aesthetic standards of our community. Please restore your yard to a compliant state within 14 days to avoid fine." Lily read the letter again, her jaw tightening. Unkempt? The garden wasn't unkempt, it was thriving. Every plant had been carefully chosen to create a natural balance. And what did they mean by non-compliant plants? The flowers were native to the area, chosen specifically to attract pollinators. She crumpled the letter and tossed it onto the kitchen counter, frustration boiling inside her. This wasn't just about a garden, it was about control. Deborah and the HOA wanted every lawn to look the same. Short grass, a couple of identical shrubs, and nothing else. Lily's garden, with its wild beauty and purpose, challenged that uniform. Later that day, Lily called her best friend, Nicole, to vent. "Can you believe this?" she said, pacing the. "They're calling my garden unkempt and saying it doesn't comply with their precious aesthetic standards." Nicole laughed on the other end of the line. "That's classic HOA nonsense. What are you going to do?" Lily stopped pacing, her resolve hardening. "I am not tearing it down, that's for sure. I worked too hard for. If they think I am just going to roll over, they've got another thing." Lily wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. If Deborah and the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get. Lily stared at the crumpled HOA letter on her counter, her frustration simmering. She couldn't understand how anyone could look at her garden, a vibrant, blooming oasis, and call it unkempt. The accusation of non-compliant plants felt even more absurd. Every flower and shrub she'd planted had been chosen specifically for its beauty and environmental benefit. But this wasn't about reason, it was about control. Deborah, the HOA president, seemed determined to impose her rigid vision of perfectly manicured lawns, and cookie-cutter landscaping on the entire neighborhood. Lily had seen her do it before, finding one neighbor for having garden gnomes that clashed with the aesthetic, and another for daring to install a bright blue mailbox. Still, Lily decided to approach the situation calmly. Maybe, just maybe, there had been a misunderstanding. The next morning, she called the HOA office to set up a meeting. When Lily arrived, the office was as unwelcoming as she had imagined. Beige walls, outdated furniture, and a large framed copy of the HOA's landscaping guidelines hanging prominently near the reception desk. Behind the desk sat Deborah, her ever-present clipboard in hand. Her expression was polite but distant, the kind of look someone wears when they're prepared to dismiss you before you even start talking. "Deborah," Lily began, trying to keep her voice calm and steady, "I am here about the letter I received regarding my garden. I am not sure I understand the violation. Could you clarify what part of my yard doesn't comply?" Deborah glanced at her clipboard and then back at Lily. "Your garden doesn't meet the community's landscaping standards, Miss Carter. We have guidelines in place to ensure a cohesive aesthetic throughout the neighborhood. Your yard, with its wildflowers and unconventional design, doesn't align with those standards." "Unconventional?" Lily repeated, incredulous. "It's a garden. It's well maintained, it's clean, and it's full of plants that are native to this area. How does that not align with the community's values?" Deborah's lips pursed. "Our standards prioritize uniformity. Short grass, neatly trimmed shrubs, and minimal decorative elements ensure the neighborhood maintains its property value. Your garden, while creative, disrupts the uniform look we strive for." Lily's frustration grew. "So you are saying I should tear out plants that attract pollinators and replace them with a plain lawn just to match the neighbors?" "That's exactly what I am saying," Deborah replied curtly. "We've had complaints that your garden looks messy and out of place. The HOA has given you 14 days to comply." Lily clenched her fists but forced herself to stay composed. "Complaints from who? The only feedback I've gotten has been positive. Neighbors have stopped to compliment the flowers and watch the butterflies." Deborah didn't flinch. "The complaints are confidential, as always." Lily left the meeting fuming. Confidential complaints? That sounded like a convenient way to avoid accountability. As she walked back to her car, she replayed Deborah's words in her mind. Uniformity, property values, disrupts the aesthetic. That evening, Lily sat on her porch, staring at her garden as the sun set. The wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, bees buzzed lazily from bloom to bloom, and the bird baths shimmered with golden light. It wasn't just a garden to Harriet, it was a little ecosystem she had worked so hard to build. She wasn't about to let Deborah destroy it. Lily decided to dig deeper. She spent the next several hours combing through the HOA's bylaws, looking for anything that would support her case. The rules were dense and filled with legal jargon, but after hours of reading, she found something promising. While the HOA enforced aesthetic standards, there were no explicit rules banning gardens. In fact, one section even mentioned exceptions for eco-friendly and sustainable landscaping efforts. The next day, Lily began documenting everything. She took photos of her garden from every angle, printed out glowing messages from neighbors who admired it, and even made a list of the pollinators it attracted. If Deborah and the HOA wanted a fight, Lily would make sure she was prepared. Lily's optimism after finding the eco-friendly landscaping clause didn't last long. Just days after her tense meeting with Deborah, a second letter arrived in the mail. This one wasn't a simple warning, it included a $250 fine, and a detailed list of demands. Remove all non-grass plants, restore the lawn to its original state, and ensure compliance within 10 days to avoid additional penalties. Lily's jaw tightened as she read the letter. The fine felt like a deliberate attempt to pressure her into giving up. To make matters worse, the letter accused her garden of creating a negative visual impact on the neighborhood, and implied it had sparked multiple complaints. But as Lily watered her plants that evening, several neighbors stopped by to chat. Mr. Jenkins gave her a cheerful wave. "I saw a hummingbird at your flowers this morning," he said, grinning. "It's the first one I've seen in years." Maggie, the young mom from down the street, walked over with her toddler in tow. "I just wanted to say, my little one loves watching the butterflies in your garden," she said with a smile. "It's beautiful, Lily. Don't let the HOA bully you." Their encouragement gave Lily a spark of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight, even if Deborah was trying to make it seem that way. Still, the stakes were rising. Later that week, as Lily was weeding the garden, she noticed Deborah and another HOA board member walking down the street. They paused at the edge of her yard, their clipboards in hand, whispering and jotting down notes. Lily could feel their disapproval radiating across the fence. "Can I help you?" Lily called, standing up and brushing dirt off her gloves. Deborah gave a tight smile. "Just conducting a routine inspection, Miss Carter," she said. "Routine?" Lily raised an eyebrow. "Funny how these inspections only started after I planted this garden." Deborah didn't respond. She simply scribbled something onto her clipboard and walked away, leaving Lily. That night, as Lily sat on her porch watching the fireflies, she realized she needed a new strategy. Fighting the HOA on the grounds of aesthetic standards was like trying to hit a moving target. Deborah could always twist the rules in her favor. But if Lily could prove her garden had value, tangible value, she could make it harder for Deborah to argue again. She started researching ways to protect her garden. That's when she stumbled across the concept of a certified wildlife habitat. The program, run by a national conservation organization, recognized gardens that provided food, water, and shelter for local wildlife. Certification wasn't just a badge of honor, it came with legal recognition that could make it harder for HOAs to demand changes. Lily immediately got to work. She documented every detail of her garden: the native plants, the bird bath, the butterfly house, and even the small patch of clover she'd planted for pollinators. She snapped photos of bees on her flowers and sparrows splashing in the water. She researched the specific benefits of her garden, from reducing water use to supporting endangered pollinators, and included them in her application. Within a week, she received an email confirming that her garden met all the criteria. She was officially approved as a certified wildlife habitat. Lily printed out the certificate and framed it, a mix of pride and relief washing over her. But she didn't stop there. She created a flyer explaining what a certified wildlife habitat was and how her garden benefited the neighborhood. She made copies and hand-delivered them to her neighbors, including the ones she didn't know well. Most of them were enthusiastic. Maggie even suggested starting a neighborhood group to encourage more eco-friendly landscaping. "Imagine if every yard looked like yours," she said. "It'd be amazing." Lily's efforts didn't just educate her neighbors, they shifted the narrative. Suddenly, it wasn't about whether her garden was messy or non-compliant. It was about protecting wildlife, conserving resources, and making the neighborhood a better place to live. But Lily knew Deborah wouldn't go down without a fight. The HOA president's pride was on the line, and she'd likely come back swinging. Deborah didn't waste any time striking back. Just days after Lily began distributing flyers about her certified wildlife habitat, another letter arrived from the HOA. This one accused Lily of violating zoning regulations by creating a structure that encouraged congregation without proper approval. The letter claimed that her garden was causing an increase in foot traffic and disrupting the peace of the neighborhood. Lily stared at the letter in disbelief. Foot traffic? Disruption? The only people who came to her garden were neighbors walking by and admiring Deborah herself, clipboard in hand. It was a laughable accusation, but it was clear Deborah was grasping at straws to pressure Lily into submission. But Lily wasn't laughing. Deborah's attempts to twist the rules showed just how far she was willing to go. The next morning, as Lily tended to her flowers, Mr. Jenkins shuffled over, leaning on his cane. "Saw Deborah prowling around here again last night," he said, shaking his head. "She's determined to make trouble." Lily sighed. "She's trying to use zoning rules against me now. Apparently, my garden is a disruption." Mr. Jenkins snorted. "A disruption? That's rich coming from someone who fines people for leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes late. Don't worry, Lily, you've got more supporters than you think." And he was right. As word of Deborah's antics spread, more neighbors began reaching out to Lily, offering their support. Maggie, the young mom down the street, organized a small gathering in Lily's front yard to discuss how the garden was benefiting the neighborhood. A handful of parents brought their kids to see the butterflies and birds, and even a few skeptical neighbors who had been wary of crossing Deborah showed up to listen. "This garden isn't just beautiful, it's educational," said Maggie, gesturing to the butterfly house. "My son learned about pollinators because of this. How can that be a bad thing?" Mrs. Patel, who lived 2 doors down, nodded. "I've started planting wildflowers in my own yard after seeing what Lily's done. It's inspired me to use less water and try more native plants." As neighbors began sharing their stories, the gathering felt less like a meeting and more like a celebration of what Lily's garden had brought to the community. Deborah, of course, was nowhere to be seen, but Lily knew the HOA president wouldn't let this slide. Sure enough, a few days later, Lily received yet another letter. This one was the most aggressive yet, threatening legal action if the garden wasn't removed immediately. Deborah accused Lily of operating an unauthorized recreational area and claimed that the increased activity posed safety risks for children. Lily felt her frustration boil over. The accusations were ridiculous, and it was clear Deborah was weaponizing HOA rules to scare her into submission. But Lily wasn't scared, she was ready. She called Maggie and a few other supportive neighbors and explained the situation. Together, they decided to escalate their response. Maggie started a petition demanding that the HOA drop the fines and recognize Lily's garden as a community asset. Within days, dozens of neighbors had signed, including some who rarely participated in neighborhood activities. "We're tired of Deborah's nonsense," said Mr. Jenkins as he added his name to the petition. "She's been bullying people for years, and it's about time someone stood up to her." Lily also reached out to a local conservation group that had helped her with her wildlife habitat certification. They were thrilled to hear about her garden and offered to write a letter of support, emphasizing the environmental and educational benefits it provided. With the petition and the letter in hand, Lily prepared for the next HOA meeting. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Deborah wasn't the type to admit defeat, but she also knew she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The evening of the HOA meeting arrived, and Lily felt a mix of nerves and determination as she walked into the community center. The room was already buzzing with activity. Neighbors filled the seats, chatting in hushed tones, while the HOA board sat at a long table at the front, with Deborah positioned squarely in the center, her infamous clipboard resting in front of her. Lily scanned the room, and was relieved to see Maggie, Mr. Jenkins, and several other supportive neighbors sitting together in the audience. Maggie gave her a thumbs up, and Lily took a deep breath. This wasn't just about her garden anymore, it was about standing up to the overreach and control Deborah had wielded for years. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the tension in the room was palpable. When the agenda reached the point about non-compliant landscaping, Deborah's tone turned icy as she addressed the audience. "Before we proceed, I'd like to remind everyone that our HOA's guidelines exist to maintain the aesthetic and safety standards of our community," Deborah began, her voice sharp. "One resident's disregard for these rules has created disruption and set a troubling precedent. This board is here to ensure that doesn't happen." Lily clenched her fists, but kept her face calm as Deborah gestured toward her. "Miss Carter's front yard garden, while creative, violates multiple guidelines. It has generated numerous complaints and presents safety concerns due to increased foot traffic," Deborah continued. "The board recommends immediate action to restore the property to compliance." Murmurs rippled through the audience, but before Deborah could continue, Lily stood. "I'd like to respond to those claims," she said, her voice steady. Deborah frowned, but motioned for her to proceed. Lily walked to the front of the room, holding a folder filled with documents. "First, I'd like to address the claim that my garden has generated numerous complaints. I've spoken to many of my neighbors, and I have letters from over 30 of them stating their support for my garden. In fact, most of them have expressed that the garden has been a positive addition to the neighborhood." She handed the letters to one of the board members, who began flipping through them. "Second," Lily continued, "my garden is not non-compliant. The HOA's own guidelines make exceptions for eco-friendly landscaping and sustainable practices, which is exactly what my garden represents. It's also a certified wildlife habitat, officially recognized for providing food, water, and shelter to pollinators and birds." She held up her framed certification and passed around a copy for the board to review. The audience began murmuring again, this time with more enthusiasm. A few people clapped, and Deborah's expression grew tighter. "Third," Lily said, her voice rising slightly, "I want to address the accusation that my garden is a safety risk. This is not a playground or a recreational area, it's a garden. People walk by to admire it, just as they would admire any landscaping. The suggestion that it creates a safety risk is baseless and frankly insulting." Maggie stood up from the audience. "And we love walking by it," she called out. "My son has learned more from Lily's garden than any science book. It's a gift to this neighborhood." Applause broke out, and several neighbors chimed in with similar sentiments. "It's inspired me to plant wildflowers," one woman said. "She's done nothing wrong," added another. Deborah banged her gavel, her frustration evident. "Order, please," she snapped. Turning to Lily, she said, "While your points are noted, this board must consider the larger implications. If we allow one property to deviate from the standards, what stops others from doing the same? We have rules for a reason. Lily smiled calmly. Rules are meant to protect a community, Deborah, not to stifle it. My garden doesn't hurt anyone. It enhances the neighborhood, supports the environment, and aligns with the values of progress and sustainability. If the board is truly here to serve the community, then listen to them. She gestured toward the audience, many of whom were nodding and clapping. One of the board members, a man named Greg, raised his hand. I'd like to say something, he began. I think Lily has made an excellent case. The certification alone shows the garden has value, and the community's response is overwhelmingly positive. Frankly, I don't see a problem here, only an opportunity for us to adapt and improve. The room erupted into applause again, and Deborah's face turned crimson. She tried to push for another vote to enforce compliance, but the board was divided, with several members now siding with Lily. After some tense back and forth, it became clear Deborah didn't have the majority support she needed. Greg finally spoke up again. I move to dismiss the fines against Lily and formally recognize her garden under the eco-friendly landscaping exception. The vote passed 4-1, with Deborah casting the lone dissenting vote. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors gathered around Lily to congratulate her. You did it, Maggie said, throwing her arms around her. Mr. Jenkins grinned. About time someone put Deborah in her place. Even some board members approached Lily to apologize for the ordeal, promising to revisit the outdated rules that had caused the issue in the first place. Deborah, meanwhile, slipped out of the room without a word, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. In the weeks following the dramatic HOA meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. Lily's victory over Deborah wasn't just a personal win, it was a spark that ignited change. For years, many residents had silently endured the HOA's nitpicking and rigid rules, but now they saw that pushing back was possible. Lily's garden, once the target of fines and accusations, became a source of inspiration. Neighbors who had previously stuck to the HOA's strict standards began experimenting with their own yards. Maggie planted a small patch of milkweed to attract monarch butterflies, and Mrs. Patel turned part of her lawn into a vegetable garden. Even Mr. Jenkins added a bird feeder to his porch, joking that his house was going wild now. What started as a single garden began to transform the entire neighborhood. More and more residents embraced native plants and sustainable landscaping, creating a patchwork of vibrant, living yards that stood in stark contrast to the sterile uniformity Deborah had fought to preserve. To celebrate, Maggie organized a neighborhood garden tour, with Lily's yard as the centerpiece. Families strolled through the streets, admiring the variety of plants and chatting about their own gardening projects. Lily's butterfly house was a hit with the kids, who squealed with delight every time a monarch landed nearby. During the tour, Greg, the HOA board member who had supported Lily, pulled her aside. I wanted to thank you, he said. You've shown us that the old rules need to change. We're already working on revising the guidelines to be more flexible and environmentally friendly. Lily smiled. That's great to hear, Greg. It's about time the HOA worked with the community instead of against it. Meanwhile, Deborah's influence in the neighborhood had all but vanished. After losing the vote at the meeting, she had retreated from her role as the self-appointed enforcer of HOA rules. Rumors swirled that she was planning to move to another neighborhood, though no one seemed particularly upset about the prospect. One Saturday morning, as Lily was tending to her garden, Maggie walked over with her son, who was holding a drawing of butterflies he had made. We wanted to say thank you, Maggie said, smiling. Your garden has made such a difference. It's not just about the flowers, it's brought the neighborhood together. Lily crouched down to admire the drawing, her heart swelling with pride. You know, she said, when I started this, I just wanted a space for the birds and the bees. I never imagined it would mean so much to everyone else. Maggie laughed. Well, it does. You've shown us that our yards don't have to all look the same. They can be beautiful and meaningful. As Maggie and her son walked away, Lily stood in her garden, watching as a butterfly landed on a coneflower. The sun was warm on her face, and the soft hum of bees filled the air. Lily had fought hard to protect her little patch of nature, and in doing so, she had changed more than just her yard, she had changed her community. What started as a battle against outdated rules had blossomed into something much bigger, a neighborhood that embraced creativity, connection, and the beauty of the natural world. And as Lily looked around at the vibrant, thriving gardens that now dotted the street, she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning.